Imagine, if you will, a laboratory where all of the chemical containers have no labels, where all of the measuring tools and vessels have no markings, and where all of the chemicals are the same color. There would be no way to tell which chemicals you are using. There would be no way to measure them. And there would be no way to know what hazards they present, or what would happen if you combined them. This is the way you might feel in your lab if it weren't for OSHA's laboratory standard. OSHA's Hazard Communication or Right to Know standard helps ensure that we get the information and training we need to work safely with hazardous chemicals. OSHA's laboratory standard goes one step further by requiring employers to maintain a chemical hygiene plan. This written program identifies the procedures and equipment that are used to protect employees from hazardous chemicals in laboratory environments. But what is a laboratory according to OSHA, and how is it different from other workplaces? First and foremost, in a lab, work with chemicals is carried out on a laboratory scale. This means that the containers used for reactions, transfers, and other handling of chemicals can be used easily and safely by one person. The use of a variety of different chemicals or chemical procedures is also a characteristic of laboratories. However, none of the procedures in use can be part of or a simulation of a production process, such as setting up a prototype production line. A laboratory must also have protective equipment and practices available and in use to minimize employees' exposure to hazardous chemicals. Your facility's chemical hygiene officer can answer questions about working with hazardous chemicals in a laboratory environment and the details of your facility's chemical hygiene plan. Among other things, the chemical hygiene plan outlines the standard operating procedures you should follow when working with chemicals. The first step is to figure out what hazards, if any, the chemical you are using presents. As you know, the Material Safety Data Sheet, or MSDS, is the primary source for information about a chemical. Your facility maintains an MSDS for every chemical in your laboratory. The MSDS lists all of the names the chemical goes by, the company that manufactures it, and any hazardous ingredients that the chemical contains. The MSDS also describes the types of hazards that the chemical may present, first aid procedures for chemical exposures, as well as spill cleanup techniques. To help you work with the chemical safely, the MSDS also tells you how to handle and store the chemical properly, and what exposure controls and personal protective equipment to use to protect yourself. Material safety data sheets can come in different formats, but they all contain the same kinds of important information. Remember to read the MSDS before you work with an unfamiliar chemical. This will help you prevent problems. You should also review MSDSs from time to time while you work to make sure you are using the chemical safely. MSDSs get updated periodically, so make sure you're looking at the most recent version. Another source of hazard information in your lab is the chemical's container labels. Remember to read the container label before working with any chemical. This label identifies the chemical, its primary hazards, and any required safety precautions. Like MSDSs, all labels do not present information in the same way. Some labels are written. Others use shapes, numbers, or letters as warnings. There are also labels that use symbols or pictures to represent hazards or required personal protective equipment. And remember, anytime you transfer a chemical to another container, it's your responsibility to label that container as well, so everyone else will know what's inside. Your facility probably has a standardized labeling system for these secondary containers. All chemicals need to be handled with care, but hazardous chemicals demand an extra degree of caution. The protective measures we should take depend on the hazards of the material. For the purposes of the laboratory standard, a hazardous chemical is a substance that has the potential to cause negative health effects. Chemicals can be divided into 5 categories based on the type of health hazard each presents: sensitizers, irritants, corrosives, toxic chemicals, and carcinogens. After repeated exposures to a sensitizer, many people develop an allergic skin reaction, such as a mild rash. A single exposure to an irritant may cause inflammation of the skin, eyes, or respiratory system. These effects are usually temporary. On the other hand, a corrosive can cause irreversible damage in the form of severe burns. A toxic chemical has the potential to disrupt bodily functions, such as breathing or blood circulation. Some toxic chemicals have target organ effects, which means they damage specific organs, such as the lungs, kidneys, or liver. A poison is an extremely toxic substance that can cause death in a short period of time, even in a very small dose. As you know, a carcinogen is a substance that, over time, can cause cancer. Once we have used resources such as the MSDS and the container label to identify the hazards a chemical presents, we need to take steps to protect ourselves. There are 3 basic approaches: administrative controls, engineering controls, and personal protective equipment. Most situations call for the use of all 3. Administrative controls can include general policies, specific procedures, and even work schedules that limit or eliminate your chances of exposure. Engineering controls are physical barriers or equipment, such as splash shields and laboratory hoods, that can reduce or prevent exposure. Personal protective equipment is your last line of defense against exposure to hazardous chemicals, but it must be the first thing you take care of whenever you enter the lab. If you are ever uncertain as to what protection to use, consult your chemical hygiene plan or ask your supervisor. Guessing about PPE can have serious consequences. Safety glasses are usually the minimum requirement for eye protection in the laboratory. Work involving corrosive liquids or other splash hazards may require splash-proof goggles or the addition of a face shield. Surgical and other rubber gloves can protect your hands from most contact hazards. Insulated gloves are needed when working with very hot or very cold materials. Respiratory protection in the lab ranges from the simple filter mask to the air-purifying cartridge respirator to the self-contained breathing apparatus. No matter what kind of respirator you use, you must be tested for a proper fit. If a respirator does not fit correctly, it will not protect you. Hazardous fumes may leak in through gaps between the mask and your face. When selecting PPE, remember to consider all the hazards that a material presents. For example, when working with cryogenic liquids, you need to wear goggles and a face shield to defend against splashes, and insulated gloves to protect your hands. Laboratory hoods are the most common engineering control used in the lab. They can protect us from hazardous chemicals, but only if we use them properly. As you know, a lab hood is a ventilated enclosure that helps contain fumes and vapors. But in order for it to do its job, we can't block the flow of air with equipment or materials. A lab hood can also act as a physical barrier against spills, splashes, and explosions, but only if we do our part by lowering the sash when we work. Remember that a lab hood is a tool for your protection, not a storage cabinet for materials or equipment. Storing chemicals in a hood can be dangerous, especially if they are flammable or reactive. So always return supplies and glassware to their appropriate storage places. Training is also a key part of being able to work with chemicals safely. A training schedule and other details of your facility's chemical safety training program are included in the chemical hygiene plan as well. Learning to handle glassware safely is particularly important because improper handling of glassware is the leading cause of accidents in the lab. When hazardous chemicals are involved, little accidents can develop into significant exposure situations. So we have to work safely from the start. Inspect glassware for cracks, chips, and other flaws before using it. Even a hairline crack can cause big problems, especially if you add heat. Heating glass causes it to expand, putting pressure on the flaw until it fractures. When handling heated glassware, remember to use insulated gloves. Forgetting this could cause things to get out of hand. Returning equipment to its proper place and keeping glassware away from the edge of shelves and countertops will also help prevent problems. Sometimes a chemical spill leads to an exposure situation. There are 4 basic routes of entry or ways a chemical can get into the body: contact with the skin or eyes, inhalation, ingestion, and injection. Let's look at first aid procedures for each type of exposure. If a hazardous chemical comes into contact with the skin or eyes, it could cause a localized reaction, or it could be absorbed into the bloodstream and circulated throughout the body. In these cases, water is your first line of defense against injury. Make sure you know the locations of the nearest safety showers and eye washes. In fact, you should be able to find them with your eyes closed, because one day you might have to. If a chemical splashes into your eyes, get to an eye wash as quickly as possible. Hold your eyes open and in the stream of water for at least 15 minutes. This may feel uncomfortable, but your eyesight could be at stake. If a chemical splashes onto your body, call out for help and head for the nearest safety shower. You'll have to remove your PPE and your clothing. The shower water may be cold, but remember, a corrosive chemical can cause permanent damage. You need to stay in the shower for at least 15 minutes, rinsing the affected areas thoroughly. Inhalation is another possible route of entry. If someone inhales hazardous gas, fumes, or vapors, the best thing to do is get that person out of the area and into fresh air. The third route of entry is ingestion. If someone swallows a chemical, consult the MSDS for instructions. They may need to take an antidote or drink water or milk to dilute the chemical. Injection is another route of entry to be aware of. Needles aren't the only source of this kind of exposure. Broken glassware or sharp instruments can also cause trouble. Report any exposure to a hazardous chemical to your supervisor. Then seek professional medical attention as quickly as possible. No matter how minor the exposure may seem, remember, even small doses of some chemicals can have serious health effects. By definition, accidents always take us by surprise, so we need to be prepared to deal with emergencies before they happen. Consult the MSDS or your chemical hygiene plan before you start to work with a chemical or a process. If there is a leak or spill of a hazardous chemical, quickly evaluate the situation. First, attend to anyone who is injured. If other people are in danger, evacuate the area immediately. Then, notify the appropriate personnel. Depending on how serious the situation is, this may be your supervisor, your facility's chemical hygiene officer, or an outside hazmat response team. If it's a spill or leak that you can handle yourself, work to contain it. Use an absorbent pillow or neutral material to create a barrier around the chemical. Then, clean it up. But remember that not all chemicals should be handled the same way. Many chemicals can be absorbed with a non-reactive material, such as vermiculite or dry sand. However, inorganic acids and bases need to be absorbed with a neutralizing substance, such as soda ash. Check the MSDS for proper cleanup procedures. If there's a chance that you have been exposed to a hazardous chemical, you will be given the opportunity to talk to a doctor to see if you need a more detailed medical examination. You can also receive a medical exam if you ever display any symptoms of exposure to a hazardous chemical, even if it can't be traced to a specific incident. Work with some hazardous substances, such as formaldehyde, is specifically regulated by OSHA. If you work around these types of chemicals, medical surveillance in the form of periodic examinations or medical tests may be required. Any medical consultations, examinations, or tests you receive will be performed by or under the direct supervision of a licensed physician and will be provided to you free of charge. For more information about medical examinations and surveillance, consult your supervisor or your facility's chemical hygiene plan. So far, we have only talked about health hazards associated with chemicals. That's because they are the focus of OSHA's laboratory standard. But we must protect ourselves from other dangers in the laboratory as well. Some chemicals can present physical hazards. For instance, working with flammable or combustible chemicals requires special precautions. These types of hazards are covered by OSHA's Hazard Communication Standard. The safe handling of compressed gas cylinders is also very important. Chemicals are stored in these containers under great pressure. As a result, the rupture of a valve or cylinder can be extremely dangerous. At times, protecting yourself from biological hazards may be an issue. OSHA's bloodborne pathogen standard focuses on precautions to take around viruses, bacteria, and other bloodborne biohazards. This information can be found in your facility's exposure control plan. Other types of hazards can also be encountered in the laboratory: lasers, ultraviolet light, X-ray radiation. These all play important roles in the lab, but they can also be dangerous if we don't take the proper precautions. Remember, if you ever have questions about safety, you can talk to your facility's chemical hygiene officer, safety director, or your area supervisor. There's no guesswork involved with working safely in the laboratory. OSHA's laboratory standard and your facility's chemical hygiene plan. Spell out the steps to follow to protect yourself from hazardous chemicals. Be aware of the hazards around you. Read material safety data sheets and container labels before working with a chemical or process. Take steps to minimize any dangers. Wear the appropriate personal protective equipment and follow safe work practices. Be prepared for emergencies before they happen. Know what to do, where to go, and who to contact in an exposure situation. If you think you've been exposed to a hazardous chemical, don't take any chances. Consult a physician immediately. If you have questions, ask your supervisor or your chemical hygiene officer. Remember, the laboratory is no place to hazard a guess about safety.